Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Vicarious Trauma and Vicarious Resilience. Siboney and Breeze, the Workplace Coordinator, TMHA VC Division. Today's webinar, we will discuss the effects of vicarious trauma on well-being when hearing and engaging with difficult and disturbing stories that happen to others, and how to apply vicarious resilience in the workplace. Please be aware that this session will be recorded and posted on our website, Care for Caregivers, for you to watch later or share with friends and colleagues. If you're experiencing any technical issue, please send us your question on the QA box or an email to webinars@safecarebc.ca. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. I want to start by recognizing that we are gathered on the ancestral and unceded territory of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across British Columbia. We would thank them for being good caretakers of the land and allowing us to be visitors of this shared territory to do good work. This free webinar is brought to you by Care for Caregivers, an online mental health resource for healthcare workers in British Columbia. This is a joint initiative of the Canadian Mental Health Association BC Division and Safe Care BC, funded by the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions. I'm joined today by Rebecca Higgins, who is a mental health educator and has worked in community and social services for over 23 years by providing consultation support to mental health initiatives for a wide range of groups, including educators, caregivers, artists, librarians, customer service professionals, and many more. If you have any questions, please use our QA box and your questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being with us today for this webinar. Just give me one quick second to call up the workshop. For some reason it closed. I'll be with you momentarily. There we go. Okay, perfect. So today we're talking about vicarious trauma and vicarious resilience. I'll explain a little bit about what that is as we go. Some background about me is there on the screen, but Siboney already introduced me, so that's probably enough for now. Thank you so much again for joining us for this important topic. My contact info will be available at the end if you have more questions or want to follow up about additional workshops or anything like that. So just to let you know a little bit about the language I'm using today and why. You may have heard of vicarious trauma. Oh, I just see a couple of folks have their hands up here. I think, okay, I'll just continue. And then if you feel free to pop your questions in the chat there. Or in the Q&A rather. So some terms I'm using today, I'm using these terms a little bit interchangeably: vicarious trauma, indirect trauma, and secondary trauma. So it's up to you what words you use. The references I use different ones. Vicarious trauma is the one that's in the heading, the subject matter of this, but just want to let you know that when I use these all may mean the same thing. And we're going to explain a little bit more now what this is. So I am quite sure that you have heard of vicarious trauma, although you may have called it something else. Many of you may have heard of it already. Let's do a show of electronic hands. How many people think that at some point in their career they have experienced vicarious trauma? I'm showing up my human hand as opposed to my electronic hand, but I can see many, many people raising their hands to join me in this. Yes, absolutely. So I'm not going to spend too much time defining it because many of you already have experienced it and know what it is. And then we're going to look at the concept of vicarious resilience and how we can apply that a little bit. We're going to try a couple exercises together again a little bit later that I hope will be valuable for you as they have for me. So vicarious or secondary trauma involves a change in the helper's inner experience. So because we are engaging empathically with the people we care for, so inside and outside of work, this may be for some of you, certainly as part of your work as healthcare providers, you're caring for others in pain who may be sometimes experiencing physical and emotional pain. They may be experiencing one of the worst times of their lives in some cases. And in the very act of showing up and being with that person in a genuine way, that's a real gift that you're offering. And at the same time, understandably, that can take a toll on you over time. We have our own trauma responses, and vicarious trauma, I think of it sort of like secondhand smoke, in that it can have a significant impact on us, even if we aren't the ones who are experiencing this particular trauma. But certainly it can directly, but certainly it can recall trauma experiences from other aspects of our lives. And even if it's not related to something we've experienced, again, the very gift of showing up, the gift that we offer others, the showing up and being with people in pain, means that in some moments we will be at risk for vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma or secondary trauma happens when someone else is harmed physically or emotionally, and it has an effect on us. So just a quick review. I like this definition of trauma from Gilbert Elliott because it's quite clear. Any event that overwhelms our normal coping resources and harms our mind or body. So secondary trauma is when we are supporting someone or bearing witness to someone's pain or listening to someone's story or reading reports. And in fact, sometimes secondary trauma can also be exacerbated or triggered by things like, disturbing news coverage, the kinds of media that we're exposed to, and so on. So, but here, for the most part, because you are dealing with traumatized people very often in your work, that's the examples I have in my mind as we move through it in terms of those potential moments or experiences that might impact your well-being as well. So this is a very understandable response. I try not to use the word normal because what it even is normal, but it's a very understandable response. If you are experience vicarious trauma, and I see many of you have, certainly I have on a number of occasions, sometimes we will slide into, oh, it's my fault. If I were tougher, or if I was more resilient, or, if any number of things, then this wouldn't have happened. So one of the most important things I think we can do for ourselves and each other is to normalize those reactions. Of course, bearing witness to other people's pain can be painful for us as well. That's a very understandable response. And it doesn't mean that you are bad at your job, certainly. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't even mean that you've done anything wrong. If you're experiencing vicarious trauma, it is an understandable response to being alongside someone that you're caring for and caring about. So it can impact anyone interacting with traumatized persons. So we now know that most of us carry some trauma with us, and some people carry a lot of layers of complex trauma that may or may not impact impact our lives in every day, but certainly recognizing that most people we encounter are carrying something with them goes for any population, but certainly healthcare providers and people caring for people in pain outside of work. I want to highlight that too, because so many of you, I'm sure, are also, in fact, I'll do another show of hands again, if you don't mind. How many people are caring for someone outside of work who might be in pain or struggling? Caring for someone outside of work, so let's somebody going through a health crisis, somebody grieving, somebody dealing with trauma, all of the above, someone dealing with, so supporting someone outside of work as well as within work. So a good number, it looks like maybe at least a quarter, maybe more of folks as well have been experiencing that. And certainly I have found that when in those moments, so my background is social work. I don't do social work proper these days. I do this instead, which I love. But there have been moments where the social work in previous jobs that were more like conventional social work, I might have been dealing with vicarious trauma related to those I was supporting and carrying their pain with me, as well as caring for people outside of work as well. So many of you having that same experience of potentially supporting and caring for and caring about maybe several people or more that are experiencing pain. So sometimes I would say of the three terms, indirect trauma is my least favorite because it sounds like it's not significant, but I think that vicarious trauma and its impact on us is it can be really significant. But anyway, we'll use this too, so you can use whatever you like. So vicarious trauma refers to the impacts of experiencing traumatic material secondhand. So mental, physical, emotional, behavioral, spiritual. Indirect trauma is a very human phenomenon, and I want to emphasize that part here. If a person holds the capacity for empathy, they will experience distress when hearing about or witnessing the suffering of others. In keeping with this, indirect trauma has also been defined as the cost of caring. So I like that reminder there from Fisher's book on resilience, balance, and meaning. I like that reminder of it's a very human phenomenon, the experience of vicarious or secondary trauma. So I will invite you, I'll go over a couple of these here, and I would invite you to share in the Q&A any other signs that you've noticed in yourself that you might be experiencing secondary trauma and its effects. So here are some of the ones that people have had before: becoming cynical, losing hope, avoiding work or social contact. That's a big one for me. Becoming fearful and overprotective because the world is seen to be dangerous. So that hypervigilance, we'll talk a little bit more about that, is a very understandable reaction. Setting rigid boundaries in relationship or displaying a lack of boundaries and rescuing others. For me, that's a real red flag, is when I get super fixy and get all my mitts in other people's business more than usual. Sometimes people will set more rigid boundaries. And in both of these cases, these are often unconscious strategies to protect ourselves, to navigate through this as best as we can. But also it gives us information about how we're doing and what might be happening within us and in our lives. And abandoning spiritual beliefs. So that's important, looking at not spiritual beliefs perhaps, but also worldview. For example, if you believe that most people have some goodness in them, and then as a result of your experience of trauma, you may understandably see danger around every corner, have difficulty seeing goodness in people like you used to. That can be very painful. That shift, it doesn't feel like we're ourselves. And that's kind of what it comes down to. We're not how we usually are. We're not operating in the world and in our lives the way we ordinarily would as a result of this vicarious trauma. So going to the chat, I see some great examples. Please keep them coming. Depression, burnout, difficulty focusing, becoming discouraged. Absolutely. All of them. Keep them coming. Anything else you can think of that's been signs for you? I have a really clear one that has come up for me when I have been struggling the most. And it is this thought. The thought goes, it's never going to be enough. No matter what I do, it's never going to be enough. And I remember once feeling some flickers of resentment towards somebody I was caring for in a job situation where I was very stressed, and really it was not the best fit for me to begin with, but I was extremely stressed and I was trying to support someone who was struggling. And I just felt this exhaustion through my whole spirit, bones, in my feelings, and I just thought, it's never going to be enough. No matter what I do, it's never going to be enough. So for me, that's one of the flags that, okay, things aren't great if that's the mindset that I'm getting into. So paying attention. I'm just going through some of the other great stuff here, seeing some physical changes, some relations changes in sleep. Absolutely. Losing my patience, over volunteering, creating busy work. I appreciate that because oh, just a quick note. You're looking at the Q&A. You should be able to see the responses in the Q&A, I believe, just not in the chat. So yeah, I will explain that. Let me just see a quick check. I just want to speak to the point there around over volunteering, creating busy work. We do find that people work more at paid or unpaid work, or do more and extra, and it's tricky because sometimes that kind of behavior gets rewarded by people around us, and many of us may have been, I shouldn't speak for you. For me, one of the things that drew me to the helping profession in the first place was that need to be needed and wanting to show up and be with people, which can be beautiful, but also can mean that sometimes when I'm struggling, I get a little bit too much into that zone and not so much paying attention to what's happening for me, which means that it has an impact on how I am with people. Good. So substance use. Yeah. And what do I mean by rigid boundaries? So what I mean by this is, let's say, there's many examples of it, but perhaps, you ordinarily would enjoy going out with a friend. You don't want to see your friends anymore because you can't run the risk of them talking to you about stuff that's hard. And I've had that experience for sure, where I thought I can't have another conversation about how difficult people's stuff is because I have nothing else. There's nothing in the tank here. So that could be rigid boundaries, cutting people off, or changing your behaviors in ways that aren't beneficial for you, right? Or there's another piece around this. When I first started in the field, remember overhearing a couple of people. It was an Ontario Works office, a welfare office, and where I was doing a placement from social work school. And I remember hearing people talking on the phone, and there were a couple of workers who talked like the money was coming out of their own pockets. They talked to the people on the phone, their clients, in a condescending and sort of dismissive way. And at the time I thought, oh no, what's happening here? But I understand that a bit more now, because I think that while some of us veer towards those boundaries that are too malleable, we get too fixy and too rescue-y like me, others shut down and try to protect themselves by sort of othering the person they're trying to support, and not connecting with their humanity. And that can be really painful for the other person. It's not good for us either. There's some great examples there: fearful of darkness, exhausted, jaded, withdrawn, unable to recognize success. Beautiful. So I'll just, for those of you who can't see, I'm just reading some of them. If I miss yours, I do apologize. We have a wonderful big group today. So if I accidentally skip yours, it's not intentional. Overcompensating to fill the gaps in systems. Yes, absolutely. That's beautiful. And that's another piece today. We're not talking about that too explicitly today, but systemic inequities, systemic gaps take a toll on your experience of trauma as well, right? Because that just makes sometimes the people you're supporting, some of their trauma may be coming from systems failures and systemic barriers that they've navigated. So of course that can impact you also, depending on a lot of different things. Yeah, great. I have maybe one or two friends that I can see because it would increase my energy. Yeah, and I actually think that's valuable to know. There are moments where, where that's been helpful for me, is to be more discerning than usual about what kind of social connections I can do. The tendency, and I'll speak to that in a few minutes, sometimes the tendency is to withdraw entirely because it just feels unmanageable. But in the long run, that can contribute to our isolation and actually make it more difficult to heal. So we do need to connect. That's really essential, but maybe who and how and when is a little bit different. Absolutely. Trying to be controlling can be a protective mechanism as well. Yeah. Going to worst case scenario right away. Okay. All right, so I read as many as I could. Thank you so much, everybody. I love all the things I'm seeing there. It's lovely. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. Okay, so you've shared so many here, and I think it's really important to pay attention to what your own signs are. And we're going to do an exercise in a moment that might help you personalize this a little bit in a way that's useful. But generally, we can look at these sort of groups of symptoms about how is secondary trauma affecting you. So again, for this part, I used this book, Healing Secondary Trauma, and the references are in the presentation here, so you can always rewatch it later if you'd like to be able to get down those references. So how is secondary trauma affecting you? So it may be intrusion symptoms that you're experiencing. For example, somebody mentioned darkness. It could be things that wouldn't have bothered you before the trauma, or wouldn't have been as unsettling before the trauma, that are bothering you now. For example, maybe before, you could do the dishes and drop a dish without being too startled. Maybe you'd be a little irritated, but you wouldn't feel startled. But intrusion symptoms mean the memories may come rushing back, upsetting feelings may come rushing back, even though you might be in a safe moment. After the fact, you'll notice these groups of symptoms that we're talking about in terms of secondary trauma are the same things that can happen when you're experienced a primary trauma. So in some ways, this might be similar to the individual you're supporting. So you may feel like, let's say you dropped a glass in the kitchen and the noise really bothered you, or there was some blood and that was very upsetting, and that will stay with you. Perhaps you're upset for several hours after that. Maybe you might have troubling dreams, for example, troubling memories, or strong physical reactions to memories of the trauma. For example, your heart's racing faster. Avoidance symptoms is one of the things that we've talked about here. It's interesting because avoiding things can tell us that we're having a hard time, and also it can be one of our coping strategies. But paying attention to, not all of our coping strategies help us heal. They're understandable, but not all of them help us to move through and beyond the experience of vicarious trauma. So when we're talking about avoidance symptoms, for example, it might include attempts to avoid the situation, any people that may remind you of the situation or the trauma, any activities or objects. So you might be numbing out a little bit, could be using substances or behaviors that are maybe comforting, but also may kind of buffer you or cushion you or keep you away from the distressing memories and thoughts. Avoidance symptoms seem like a good idea initially, but it can mean that our lives get smaller and smaller. Actually, we may withdraw. It may mean that we are getting we're not necessarily being able to connect in the way that nurtures us. We're not able to do things we enjoy. Everything is sort of a duck and cover mentality, which is, again, very understandable, but doesn't necessarily support us in the long run. Yes, so just to clarify, secondary trauma and vicarious trauma is the same thing. Yeah, I'm just using different language, and because the different writers I sourced here use different language, so I'm just being true to that. Negative changes in thinking and mood. So I am not a big proponent of toxic positivity. Oh, everything is good even when it's not. But here, when we're talking about negative changes in thinking and mood, maybe it is a pervasive change. It lasts. It's not balanced. There's no moments of positivity or few moments of positivity or joy or hope. Whereas ordinarily, perhaps we would have more moments of hope. We might sort of experience negative distortion. So we only see the bad around us, in other people, in ourselves, in the world. The bad can certainly be there, but if we're only able to see that, that may suggest one of the ways that trauma is affecting you. And altered arousal. So I mentioned hypervigilance. I'll give you a quick example. I was volunteering at a shelter many years ago. That was the example I told you about. Where I thought, oh, it's never going to be enough. So it was a full-time volunteer gig. I was supposed to be there for 3 months, and I lasted 2 weeks, and then I needed the better part of the year to get back to a place of well-being and okay. So it was not all the shelter's fault by any means, but by the time I went to the shelter, I didn't have anything left in the tank. I was quite distressed anyway, and I decided that I would push that to the side and focus on other people, which I don't know if any of you have tried that. It's not the best in terms of success rates. I didn't have anything to pull from the tank. There was nothing in there. I was beyond running on fumes. So understandably, I was maybe not in the best position of my life to be able to show up and support people who were experiencing trauma. But what I noticed in terms of altered arousal, and this was the first time that had happened to me, it was about 15 years ago now, is in the shelter itself, there were things that I needed to be alert and aware of. But when I left that environment and I was recovering at my parents' house and I had no responsibilities and there was nothing to worry about, and there was nothing I had to do except just be, I still felt that same degree of hypervigilance, that same degree of anxiety, feeling like there was danger around every corner, feeling very uncomfortable in my body and in the space. Being irritable or aggressive towards others, startling easily, feeling uncomfortable, having trouble concentrating. So I'm sure you may not experience all of these, and it's not an exhaustive list, but these are some groups of symptoms that people experiencing trauma and secondary trauma report having. So I'm going to speak for a few moments about risk and resilience factors when we're talking about individual factors and workplace or situational factors, because I think it's important to note that there are things that can shore us up and there are things that can make us more vulnerable, both in our own lives and in our workplace or situations. So some of this is geared towards the workplace, but certainly you can adjust this and think about your own setting if there's a setting outside of work where you're caregiving. So caregiving doesn't necessarily lead itself to vicarious trauma, but I'm talking about moments where that may be the case. So when we're talking about risk and resilience factors, if the workload is manageable, understandably, that's going to contribute to our resilience. If the workload is impossible to manage, especially for an extended period of time, that's going to contribute to our risk of vicarious trauma because we're going to be worn down. So the nature of the work itself, are there opportunities for you to find meaning and joy? Is there something that you get out of it besides financial compensation? Is there some reason why you came to it in the first place and something that keeps you going? The nature of the client group or population. So sometimes people report that if they work with a lot of people who are chronically stuck, or for example, somebody mentioned system gaps, people who are again and again have been stymied by system gaps and system failures. When you're working with people who have faced the same issues again and again, this can take a toll on you and can contribute to your trauma response. Your exposure to trauma material. So here we're talking about quantity. Are you constantly exposed to trauma material without appropriate support, for example? Is there space in between, time in between for you to recover? Supervision. In a perfect world, all of our supervisors would be supportive and on board with trauma language and flexible, and that's not always the case. So sometimes what can help if you're not getting the supervision you need in your existing supervisory relationship, are there ways you can find a mentor or a colleague or somebody outside of work, perhaps to bounce some of this stuff off of in a way that's manageable and appropriate. A supportive work environment. Of course, if we have a supportive and working environment, it is going to contribute to our resilience and cut down on our risk. And our training and professional history. So it depends. This depends on the person, but you may have had appropriate training. You may have had some work experiences that helped you to learn how to navigate difficult moments, how to support people in pain. And so all of these things can either, if they're there, they can, in particular ways, they can shore up your resilience. But if they're ruptured or they weren't there to begin with, this could potentially impact your risk factors in a negative way. So those are the sort of situational factors, but there's individual factors as well. So rewards of the work. And that's something, there are moments where the challenges of the work loom larger and take center stage, and that's completely understandable, especially in terms of the difficult work that you do. But if there are also personal rewards that we find from the work, sometimes the primary word is work, like the reason why we're doing a job in a particular moment, it might be financial. That might be the primary concern in that moment or for a longer period of time, of course. And alongside that, what are the rewards of the work? So if your work offers you the opportunity to do something that matters to you, where you find potentially pockets of joy, where there's the opportunity for learning, where you get along with people you work with, these things, the rewards of the work that you find personally can shore up your resilience. Your personal history. So depends a little bit on what, for example, when I was at the shelter in New Orleans, I didn't even know about vicarious trauma, to be honest with you, at that time. I remember coming back and talking to another social worker I knew, and she said, some of the things you're describing, it kind of sounds like PTSD. And I was like, no, I don't have PTSD. It didn't happen to me. The storm happened to those women. The hard stuff happened to them. It's not mine. But I think that when we just push it away like that, we discount our own experience. And that didn't actually help me. Yes, it happened to them. Yes, my experience was different. It wasn't the same as theirs, but also that personal history. What was I bringing to it? Did I have the resources within myself in that moment and in my life to be able to do it? And certainly I have supported people at different moments in my life. And when I'm more resourced, when I'm coming from a place of love rather than guilt, when I am doing okay in terms of my own well-being, I'm better able to support them, but also it doesn't take the same toll on me. I found that. Now, you can't control a lot of these variables for sure, but knowing what the variables are can help us to make some decisions as we navigate through these really tricky moments, and to give ourselves a break. If you are dealing with a lot of current life stress, it is understandable that you are not necessarily going to be the most patient, the most compassionate, the kindest you've ever been, the most able to process and navigate vicarious trauma. Current life stress takes a toll on us inside and outside of work. Your personal support is so important. Do you have people you can turn to? And when I say people, I also include pets in that as well. Who do you have in your life that helps shore you up? That helps, again, gives you those moments to cultivate joy, people you can turn to when you are upset, different kinds of personal support outside of work and within as well can really contribute to our resilience. And then coping style as well. So again, being aware of what your coping style is. Sometimes we can't change it or we don't want to, but being aware of what our coping style is can actually help us to navigate through these experiences of vicarious trauma and reach towards healing when we can. So what I mean by that is, I know, and some of you shared this in the Q&A as well, the more stressed I get, the more controlling I get. So that's not always my default stress mechanism, is to get really stressy and controlling. Good. So I think it invites reflection for what your own coping style is. For example, thinking about when you're stressed, and you can do this sort of over time, it doesn't have to be today, but reflecting on, when I'm overwhelmed or when the trauma of other people is taking its toll on me, how do I deal with that? Right? How do I cope? And I think we all have a broad range of coping skills, and some of them shore us up better in some moments than others, but doing some reflection around what your personal coping style is in moments when you're experiencing or could be at risk for vicarious trauma. This might involve watching some patterns over time, right? People change. We don't necessarily do the same thing every time, but learning about what works for us and what doesn't can be a helpful tool here. Okay, I'm going to invite you to do an exercise now. And I'm going to show you my example. So I quite like this because there's not necessarily always a lot we can do to prevent the experience of vicarious trauma, but we can keep an eye on how we're doing. And this is actually a way of sort of thinking through the coping style question as well. So I did an example for you so that it would be clear. So I invite you to do this now. Just sketch it out for yourself. If you want to do it, if you want to just listen, of course, that's fine too. You can choose one or more area of concern. So it's not necessarily something that is troubling you, but some sphere of your life. And the green light, yellow light, red light concept gives us information about how we're doing. So how are we doing when we're doing well? So for me in my primary relationship, if I'm doing well, if I'm not experiencing a troubling trauma response, for example, maybe I'm laughing easily, I'm enjoying his company, I'm able to find patience. I didn't say I am patient because I'm never patient, but able to find patience. Now the yellow light, maybe I'm struggling a little bit more or not feeling completely great. I'm more irritable and less patient. And then for the red light, I'm impatient. I might be passive aggressive in my case. I have no sense of humor. And somebody mentioned a lack of humor in the chat as one of your red flags or red lights in this case. I'll just quickly go through the others and then I'll invite you to just do this on your own for a moment. Actually, yeah. So in terms of work, when I'm doing well, when I'm feeling resilient, maybe I'm engaged, the work feels creative and meaningful, I'm feeling curious and interested. So this is based on my work, of course, but finding what works for you in terms of your own current position. Yellow light is when work's going okay, but I'm not as engaged, curious, or connected. I do what I have to, but I'm not enjoying it necessarily. And then red light for me in terms of work is dreading work obligations, no energy to do beyond the minimum, and getting out of things where possible. Doesn't mean I'm good or bad. It means that I might be having a harder time than when I'm in the green zone. And in terms of friendships, you can read that on your own, but I sort of identified what are some of the signs that I am thriving, or navigating life. Thriving might be pushing it, but navigating life as best I can, feeling relatively resilient and finding those pockets of joy, as I said, and then moving towards red light, where that's kind of some signs that I'm not doing so well. So you can choose one of those to do, or you can choose another area. Could be parenting or, physical exercise, some other area. So I'll just give you a minute to jot down a little bit there. And again, I'll be sharing a couple of tools with you today that I found helpful, and you can feel free to chuck them or use them as you see fit. But for me personally, I did like this when I came across this the other day in terms of having a bit of a map and just thinking through, reflecting on how am I doing when I'm doing well, and how am I doing when I'm having a hard time? Okay. So you can keep working on that if you like, or you can abandon that for now. If anybody has anything they want to share from that, go ahead and pop it in the Q&A. Okay. Okay. So Oh, I see that some people were kind of noting how they're doing today. So that's great. I was doing a map just generally, but if you want to kind of highlight how you're doing today, that's fine as well. Whatever works for you, feel free to modify this as you see fit. Okay, so show of electronic hands again. Most of you were already familiar with vicarious trauma. How many people are familiar with the concept of vicarious resilience? Thank you so much for sharing your stuff in the chat today, especially the hard stuff. I really appreciate that. So some people know about vicarious resilience, but certainly not as many as were familiar with vicarious trauma and the experience of it. I'm going to guess that you may have experienced vicarious resilience, you just may have called it something else like hope. So I'm sure that many of you have heard of post-traumatic growth. This is similar but different. In terms of post-traumatic growth, it's looking back on an experience and you know, seeing how far we've come, and sometimes difficult situations can contribute to our growth in various ways. We may find ourselves to be more resilient. We may experience, you know, some there can be good things that come out of difficulty, right? So post-traumatic growth can be a useful concept, but I am even more partial to the notion of vicarious resilience. So vicarious resilience, I'm going to explain it, and then I'll come and read the chat in case I missed anything. So I first came across this a number of years ago when I was putting together a workshop on vicarious trauma and vicarious resilience for library staff. And so in 2007, there were some researchers called Hernandez, Ganksey, and Enstrom, and they were studying psychotherapists who had been treating victims of political violence. So psychotherapists who were hearing the stories of very difficult things from their clients. And what they found in this experience, in this study rather, and it's just one study, but I think it's a useful concept. As with vicarious trauma, the worker is transformed by their empathic engagement with clients' trauma stories, but in a different, more healing way that may help them to better cope in their own lives. Let me just pause for a moment. I kind of, I didn't mean exactly like when Beyonce or Lady Gaga has an alter ego, but I kind of love that. If you want to employ that instead or as well, please do. Okay, people sharing they might be in yellow zone, red zone. Oh, thank you for sharing your hard stuff as well. And I do want to highlight that, again, I have done this more than once, many times, in fact, that when I'm feeling overwhelmed by other people's hard stuff, I retreat, I isolate to take care of myself. And because it feels unmanageable to connect with others. And that's okay, that serves its purpose. But we want to watch when that's moving into isolation, right? Sometimes we need some solitude. I certainly need alone time to replenish. But when we are when our world is getting too small, or we're not able to benefit from the connections we have with other people, it's not just that we're not supporting others, it's that we're not getting that support that we need. Sometimes that can call for a bit of an adjustment. So let me give you a little bit more concrete information here. So I love the notion of vicarious resilience as a companion to vicarious trauma, because I think both things are true. Vicarious trauma tells us that things can be terrible, which they can. Life is very difficult. People experience a lot of pain. There is a lot of struggle in our lives and in the world and in those we support. All of that is true. Vicarious resilience reminds us that there is also hope. And I love that. One doesn't negate the other. The two exist at the same time. Berthold notes that with vicarious trauma and resilience, it is not usually all negative or all positive. Frequently, trauma specialists simultaneously have symptoms of vicarious trauma and resilience. And although you may not necessarily call yourself a trauma specialist, by virtue, and some of you may, but depending on your role, but by virtue of the work you do, showing up and being with people in pain, you may have become a trauma specialist, even if that wasn't necessarily what you set out to do. So vicarious resilience isn't brushing aside difficulty. It isn't just cheer up, everything's going to be okay. It's holding both. It's recognizing the difficulty that other people are experiencing, that we may be experiencing, and also it's looking for those pockets of hope and joy. So what I'm going to invite you to do now, and I'm going to give you a few minutes to reflect on this, and then I'm going to ask you to do this in writing on your own. So take a piece of paper or a notebook for this reflection. I'm going to give you 4 minutes to reflect on this, and then we'll come back and see if anybody wants to share any aspect. But first, I'm going to explain the exercise. So do this in a way that's manageable for you today. If you are feeling really raw today, sometimes I experience that feeling like the world is too sharp and pointy and it feels like I don't have any skin on. If you're having a really sharp and difficult day like that, maybe you can just rest for this. Maybe breathe for a little bit or frame this in a way that is helpful for you. But I do want to focus. This shouldn't be too troubling anyway, because I want to focus on those pockets of hope. So think about a patient or a family member you've worked with who may have had current or past trauma experience. I don't want you to delve into their trauma or revisit your own trauma. I just want you to think of somebody that you may have seen in the course of your practice or your work, somebody who may have been in pain or had pain in the past, which is most of us, right? Somebody who is having a difficult time. I want you to reflect on that person and think about, what did you learn from this person about resilience? So again, for this exercise, I don't want you to focus on somebody else's trauma story or your own trauma story. I want you to keep that person in mind, but then focus on, what did you learn from them? So when I invite people to do this, I say you can just keep it at that question and just do a free write in response to, what did you learn from this person about resilience? If you want to, or if you want to make it a little bit more, break it down a little bit more, you can respond to any or all of the following questions. How did the person overcome adversity? What positive qualities did you see in the person? What strengths could you see in them? Where was the hope in their story? Or in what ways were you inspired by this person? So I think that we do others a disservice when we only see their pain. And we may also do them a disservice if we ignore their pain and only focus on the good stuff. This is an opportunity for you to take an experience or a reflection that may have had some pain and difficulty and hold that alongside looking at, what did you learn from this person? So I'll give you 4 minutes for this. I'm going to turn my camera off, but I will be here. If anybody has any questions about this reflection or other questions for me, in the meantime, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. But I'm going to invite you to do this for 4 minutes. We'll come back in a few minutes and see if anybody wants to share. Just about a minute or two left for this reflection. Okay, I'm seeing some beautiful stuff come up in the chat. So feel free to, I'll read a couple. Feel free to add any of your examples. And perhaps you'll share the experience of some of the ones I've read here that people are sharing. Wellness, their capacity to care and forgive, knowing your limits, never letting extreme negative experiences and trauma impact them. I'm inspired by their will to survive. A resident who found out they had a sister was able to celebrate having a sister and connected with her before she passed. Beautiful. Praying and spiritual help, perseverance, peer support, prioritizing mental well-being. Beautiful, beautiful. Anybody else? Any other things that you have learned from those you've worked with? Patients, clients, or family members over the years? Oh, I didn't scroll up enough. I see more. Formulate achievable goals, baby steps to resolve challenges. Absolutely. I've been inspired by my palliative clients who find ways to live meaningfully in the face of mortality. Beautiful. The decision to choose life and love over cynicism. Listening and helping change the mindset of self-harm. Beautiful. These are beautiful examples. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much. These are great. And keep them coming if you like. You can read others. Determination, inner strength, belief in themselves, work on improvement, will to survive. Beautiful, beautiful. And I'm not trying to romanticize pain or trauma here or gloss over the difficulty, not at all. But again, as I mentioned, sometimes we do people a disservice, I think, and ourselves a disservice when we only see the pain. And the pain is significant and the pain is there. And alongside pain, there are all of these strategies and gifts that people share with us and their stories they share with us. And by modeling ways that they navigated difficulty, we can learn from them as well. And that contributes to a more mutual relationship, to moving away from pity and towards seeing a person more fully. Great examples. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to modify some of this. We'll do a simple and quick grounding exercise. It's called Find Your Feet or Find Your Seat. And sometimes this isn't necessarily a grounding exercise. You don't just do it and then, whoa, everything's better. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. But when we're experiencing vicarious trauma responses or other kinds of struggle, we very much get into our heads and our feelings and on the discomfort in our bodies as well and our worries. And sometimes taking a moment or two to ground ourselves in our senses and in the world around us can interrupt that flow a little bit, give us a little bit of relief, a little bit of breathing room, and in so doing can help to shore up our resilience. So the quick grounding exercise I'm going to do with you today is Find Your Feet. You may have heard or read about this or experienced it. It's exactly what it says. If you have access to that today, just pay attention to how your feet feel on the ground. You might wiggle your heels a bit if it's comfortable and possible for you. Perhaps your feet are in shoes. Mine are in slippers. Paying attention to how your feet feel. Because so often we don't pay attention to the ground under our feet. So that's one. And the other one is find your seat. So if the other one isn't possible for you today, or it's more comfortable where you are, or if you just want to do both, that's fine as well. Just pay attention to how your back feels in the chair, how your seat feels in your seat. You don't have to name it. You don't have to say I'm uncomfortable or this is soft, nothing. Just direct your attention to your seat for a moment. Okay, this is a little quick one for you today. Some tips for cultivating change. And this is in terms of navigating your responses to trauma. You can't necessarily change, often you can't change the trauma or even your response to it, but what can you do in the steps and the moments after that? If you are looking at connecting more, for example, or I love somebody mentioned that actually in terms of baby steps. Those small steps are so important when we're trying to make any kind of change. Deal with one issue at a time. I always find that advice so comforting because in the experience of overwhelm, whether it be related to trauma or other difficult experiences, it feels like the world is collapsing in on us. And although that may well be exactly what's happening in, not concretely, but being able to do one thing at a time helps us to do what we can in the face of overwhelm. We can't change necessarily our circumstances, but we also can't deal with all the issues at once. So dealing with one issue at a time, starting small, going slow, these are tips that I've found helpful. Okay. The last tip I just want to offer before I turn it back to the organizers, think about, is there anything you do at the end of the day to help you transition from work to home? It could be listening to music, it could be having a snack, it could be your drive home or your transit home, listening to a podcast, changing your clothes, watering the plants, taking your dog out. So this can be another helpful way to kind of mark the ending of your workday and moving into, this is something that a lot of trauma specialists have found helpful, finding those rituals for ending the day. So I'll turn it back to the organizers, but if anybody wants to follow up with me, if you have additional questions or things I wasn't able to help you with today, please do. I will, perhaps we can put my email in the Q&A or something, or you can, where can I put it? I don't know. Anyway, you can reach out to me or reach out to Care for Caregivers and they can contact me. So thank you so much, everyone, for your participation and your engagement today. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, we will send an email to all our registrants and attendees for them to have access to your contact information. I want to take a moment to remind all of you about our Care to Speak program, which is a peer-based phone, text, and web chat service that provides free, confidential, and unbiased support to health and social support workers in BC, as well as our podcast series, Care to Listen, with a new episode now available on our website with Stacey Ashton, the Executive Director of Crisis Center of BC. Thank you, Rebecca, for presenting such relevant and important topic experienced by many healthcare and community social services workers and caregivers in general. This is a great information, and I think everyone will take a lot of takeaways. Please visit our Care for Caregivers website to register for more upcoming webinars. One link to this topic is Healing from the Impact of Trauma. We will have that one on October 25th, but we'll have more webinars for September as well. Thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. And please take some time to answer our survey once you exit the webinar. Your feedback is highly important to us to continue bringing value content. Thank you again, and have a nice rest of your day. Bye for now.